Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this Elder Justice training. And I wish I could be there in person, but thankfully, thanks to Zoom and the wonderful platform it provides, at least I can sit in my home office here in Escondido, Southern California, and share hopefully some important lessons, and really want to be able to place the crime of elder abuse firmly into the spotlight. So I call myself a newly retired Deputy District Attorney from San Diego, even though it has been actually just over 3.5. But I do want to just spend a moment to give my special thanks to the Nebraska Department of Health and Human Services, to Legal Aid of Nebraska, to the Gerontology Department of the University of Nebraska at Omaha, and of course to Nebraska Public Media for helping to stream this training today. It is absolutely important and vital that we share this information with as many folks as possible. And just a word of caution as I share my materials throughout this morning, there will be times when I will be talking about things which are unpleasant. I may well show briefly some slides which show injuries. I know some of these slides can potentially cause people some distress, but unfortunately this is the world that I have lived in for 25 years. And I just wanted to put it into context and hope that does not cause any concern for anyone, but just to let you know that the material that I talk about and use indeed does contain some kind of graphic information. So just a little bit more about my background, because even though I told you that I'm speaking to you from my home office in Escondido, Southern California, you may be saying, well, you sure don't sound like a classic Southern California dude. That would be correct. Originally from the United Kingdom, I'm just showing you here a picture of my old high school in Southern England, where I attended. It was founded in actually the late 15th century, and I'm convinced that my own history teacher was probably one of the founding members. Then why would I give you that iconic photo of the movie Easy Rider? It was that movie in the summer of 1969 that changed my whole trajectory of life, primarily, because having watched that movie, I realized that there was a whole different side to America than I had been brought up on. I had been raised on Dick Van Dyke, Rin Tin Tin, and Lassie, and suddenly I was seeing a whole new perspective. The bottom right-hand corner is the law school that I went to in Northern England called Leeds. And if any of you are fans of the ancient rock group The Who, you may well have in a cupboard a dusty album called Live at Leeds, and that's where it was recorded. I also want to show you this photo because after law school, I learned one thing: I don't want to be a lawyer. And so I spent 2 incredible years working for the British equivalent of Peace Corps in a little village in Kenya. And this gentleman, Gibson Kiboko, taught me more than anybody else I've ever met how to overcome barriers of culture, language, race, and that we give to older adults. The Kenya culture, definitely back in the 1970s, was such that you, whenever you came across an older adult, you would take the time to stop and bow and give them a greeting called Ishkamo, and they would reply Marahaba. So I learned a lot about respecting my elders through that time there in Kenya. Then I came back from Kenya and I had to make this big decision: do I become a barrister wearing the white wig and the black gown, or a general practitioner called a solicitor? And for 13 years, I actually practiced law in England as a solicitor, primarily in lower courts dealing with crime. What was interesting was that 4 days of the week I was actually acting as a defense attorney, but on day 5, I was acting as a prosecutor. And it really gave me a healthy respect for both sides of the law. You know, being a prosecutor for 25 years in San Diego, I'm so fortunate that I had the training and background as a defense attorney, which I think it really helped me a lot. So how did I make the transition and why from UK lawyer to prosecutor? The simple answer is a love story. I am fortunate enough when I was traveling around America in 1973, walked to a Baptist church in southern England, in Southern California, and sat down in the only empty seat next to this gorgeous young lady, and sat down next to her, yep, and I married her. Not in the same service, but 5 years later. But Sue is the reason that we live in San Diego, and we moved here in 1991. We had 2 children, a 10-year-old daughter and a 4-year-old son. I was jobless, unqualified. So what did I have to do? In summer of 1991, I had to sit for the dreaded California bar exam, and along with 1,000 other people. Well, thankfully, I was able to convince the bar examiners that I knew more than I really did, and thankfully, they gave me a pass. So I was sworn in as a lawyer in December of 1991. I was with a civil law firm for 2 years, and then finally I got my big break. In 1993, the San Diego District Attorney's Office was hiring. And I think I must have been the first person, literally, who ran down to the courthouse and put in my application. And it was like almost begging them in an interview, please, please, will you hire me? Because I'm desperately needing to get into the criminal courtroom and become a prosecutor. Well, thankfully, they took a risk. I was the first non-citizen, green card, resident alien that they'd ever hired as a prosecutor. Since then, obviously, I've become a very proud citizen of the United States, but at that time I wasn't, and they took a bigger risk. Now, the San Diego DA's office is known throughout the country for innovative programs. And I was so fortunate to be part of that great office for 25 years. And for 22 years, I was in the Family Protection Division. One of the programs that we're proud of is this one. And we started this program of using service animals in the courtroom with particular types of victims, child victims of abuse, sexual abuse, molestation, physical abuse. We used the dogs in the court with adults who were incapacitated, and we started using these dogs in the courtroom with older adults with some form of cognitive impairment. This has become a really fantastic program, and I believe that every prosecutor's office in the country needs to adopt this a similar program. When I started out in the elder abuse prosecution unit, I realized one thing. It's very easy to subpoena an older adult to come to court, but we need to treat them with dignity. We need to find out what they like to do. And I realized one thing, older adults are okay about coming to court as long as they don't miss their favorite program. And so we converted an office into a waiting area just for senior citizens. And this is an actual photo of one of my victims. We had an oxygen machine, we had a TV, we had a nice comfortable couch. And this was a really good thing to use before they testified in court. I can honestly tell you, in 25 years, not one day did I ever wake up thinking, I don't want to do this. And yet, in March of 2018, I literally walked out of the office to quote, retire from that office. And why would I do that? Well, it was somewhat about the numbers. I had just celebrated my 25th year work anniversary. And I thought, yeah, that's a good number to leave on. I had also just turned 66 in March of 2018, and I discovered one thing which was really incredible. If you're in full-time employment and you've never tapped into it before, you have the ability to apply for and obtain Social Security. And when I added that into my county pension that I've invested in for 25 years, it seemed to make sense. But one word of warning for all those of you who are younger out there, when you're in your late 60s, and I'm now approaching my 70th birthday, things change. I want to show you the contrast between 1979 and 2 years ago. And I show this slide to a lot of older adults in their 70s and 80s, and they really understand it. They really figure it out. But that's what I'm afraid some of us are going to be experiencing in the future, if not already. So there we go. This number also impacted my decision to leave the office. No, this is not my county pension, in case you were wondering. This is a headline that was appearing in various media outlets in early 2018. And I had questioned it, but this is the headline. And I questioned it simply because this number was something I had never heard before. You see, I had always been led to believe that the correct number was from a study that MetLife did back in 2011. And that number was apparently $2.6 billion or $2.9 billion. And here was somebody else saying it was going to be $37 billion. And yet it seemed to be appropriate. Because what I was finding in early 2018 was that more and more calls were coming into my office from adult protective services all over the country, from police agencies, from prosecutors' offices, and they all pretty much were saying the same thing. Mr. Greenwood, we are seeing a huge spike in the number of reported cases of alleged, particularly elder financial exploitation. And could you possibly come out to our jurisdiction for 24 hours, help us with a training, get us excited about doing these cases, and then go back. And I realized that if I was to do that, it would actually impact my day job. So I thought the time had come for me to spread my wings and share the information that I've been fortunate enough to learn in the courtroom with a wider audience. So that's what I've been doing for the last 3.5 years, is providing trainings for law enforcement, prosecutors, adult protective services, and of course, since the pandemic, primarily from home with AARP across the country doing various webinars. But this kind of headline, unfortunately, is becoming all too familiar. And we're seeing stories pop up almost every day. When I started out in 1996, there was no reporting of these crimes in the media at all. But now it seems to be very commonplace. This number also impacted my decision to quit, because my wife and I were about to celebrate our 40th wedding anniversary in 2018, and we decided that as a gift to each other, we needed to spend more time together. Boy, little did we know then that the pandemic was coming in. Boy, have we spent a lot more time together, which has been great. So to put it all in context, then I felt I should give you that background so you understand where I'm coming from and the influences that have been in my life. My journey into this whole arena began in January of 1996. And it all began with a call to me from my boss, the elected prosecutor, the district attorney. And isn't it funny, human nature is such that when you get a call from the boss, you think you've done something wrong. I walked into his office and I could tell he was upset. And he said, I've just had a very upsetting phone call from adult protective services. Unfortunately, I said to him, hey, I'd never heard of them. And he said, I don't know, but I know one thing though, they're angry. I said, well, what about? He said, apparently our office and law enforcement in general is ignoring a huge escalating crime called elder abuse. I said to him, what's that? He said, I don't know. You're about to find out, because I've just named you as the first head of the first ever elder abuse prosecution unit. And that's how my assignment began, literally with that conversation in late December of 1995. And so I started out in January of 1996. And I have to be honest and tell you that I thought I would only do this assignment or want to do it for 3 years maximum. And then I would get back into the real hardcore criminal prosecutions that we all dream of doing. The homicides, the rapes, the robberies. Well, the ironic thing was that this became my assignment for the next 22 years. And in fact, I was doing the homicides, the sexual assaults, the robberies. The only difference was that all of my victims were older adults over the age of 65. People along the way would ask me, why did you stick with this assignment for so many years? And why have you kept on with this assignment in a non-prosecutorial capacity since you retired? It's a very easy answer. In fact, there's two reasons. And here they are. This is my late parents. This photo was taken on my dad's 90th birthday. Sadly, my dad was diagnosed at the age of 79 with Alzheimer's. And for several years, my mother was his caregiver. And I learned a lot about the impact of Alzheimer's on the caregiver. I saw my mom's health deteriorating. And finally, we were able to convince my mother that the best place for my dad was in a memory care unit. And so for the last 5 years of my dad's life, he lived in a facility, thankfully only a mile away from his beloved house. And so on his birthday, we actually brought him back in a very old car back to his house to spend the day with us. But I don't think of my dad as an Alzheimer's victim primarily. This is how I remember my dad. My dad, I discovered at the age of 7, was a hero, a true hero. Like so many of his generation, he was a World War II bomber pilot, a B-25 pilot, and he survived 79 bombing missions. And on 78 of them, landed perfectly. But on mission number 4, on June the 4th, 1944, he was shot down by enemy aircraft over the Adriatic. Thankfully, he was rescued by Yugoslav fishermen. I grew up with stories like that from my parents. And then there's my mum, who I can tell you was the best baker of scones in the whole of the United Kingdom. My mum lived to be 96. She passed away sadly in November of 2019, but she was a true inspiration to me. High energy, tough as nails, hardworking, and she got her resilience, I believe, from having survived the Blitz in London. And the stories I heard from my mother about ducking and diving in doorways as she got off a bus after school, while these doodlebugs, these pilotless bombs would come across the English Channel and dive into London, she would literally have to dive for cover. And that's the stories that I grew up with. And so I happen to believe that my parents represent the finest generation. So the reasons that I've stayed in this whole arena is because so many of the victims that I had the privilege to pursue justice for were from that generation. So back to January of 1996, they gave me an office, a phone, a computer, everything right that a prosecutor needs, except one major problem. The one thing that I was lacking: cases. Nobody in law enforcement, and here we are a large county. Just to give you a context, we have almost 3 million people in one county, which is larger than a lot of states, including your own. In fact, if you compare the state of Vermont population-wise with my county, we are 5 times larger than the state of Vermont in population. And yet nobody from throughout the county was bringing me any cases of elder abuse. All I was battling against was silence. And this poster became my motivating factor for the next 22 years. And in fact, still is in so many ways, because literally what I would do on the way to work, I would be thinking to myself, what can I do today to break through this barrier of silence? And it was a real challenge to figure out. Now, I believe that this problem is still with us today. There is so much silence about the crime of elder abuse. That's because of lack of information, lack of awareness, lack of training. And that's why we need to put the spotlight firmly on this crime today and figure out ways in which we can break through this barrier of silence. And that's what I hope to do in my 2 sessions that you have kindly given me. What I found shocking was this. Even though we had an elder abuse criminal statute in existence since the mid-1980s, here I was 10 years later, literally almost twiddling my thumbs, waiting for somebody to bring me a case that I could then prosecute under the existing law. But nobody was doing it. That law covered 2 types of victims. And in California, we call them elders and dependent adults. And our definition of an elder is anybody over the age of 65. One of the ironic things that happened to me before I retired from the office was that the last 2 cases that I prosecuted, both victims were younger than me. So that wasn't a good fit. The other victim, dependent adult, was anyone aged 18 through 64 with either mental or physical limitations. Now, in Nebraska, you have a very similar statute defining your 2 types of victims. You call them, and it's important to get the right terminology here, vulnerable adults. And the definition for a vulnerable adult is found in this statute in Nebraska. Any person 18 years of age or older with a substantial mental or functional impairment, or for whom a guardian has been appointed under the probate code. So that is your definition of a vulnerable adult. In addition, you also recognize senior adults, and that is done on an age basis. And through this statute defines a senior adult as anybody over the age of 65. So it does mirror very closely the law that I used for 22 years to prosecute crimes of elder abuse. Also in Nebraska, the primary statute that we need to focus on is this one. It's in this, and by the way, I will make many of my slides available after today if you need them for note-taking later or just for reference. I'll be more than happy to share those with your agencies. And so this statute is the key function that we're going to focus my material on today. So a person, that's the suspect, commits knowing and intentional abuse, neglect, or exploitation of a vulnerable adult or senior adult. So those are the 2 categories of victim. If he or she, through a knowing and intentional act, causes or permits a vulnerable or senior adult to be, and then it gives you the types of conduct which fall under the umbrella of what we call vulnerable or old or senior adult abuse, okay? So here they are. Physical injuries, so that's slapping, pushing, hitting that causes injury. What I call false imprisonment, sexual abuse, financial exploitation, cruelty, neglect, or being sexually exploited. So those are various subsets of the crime of basically causing harm to either a vulnerable or senior adult in Nebraska. And many of the slides that I talk about will cover one or more of these subsections. But the point is that even though you have this excellent law, and that similarly in California, we had that law, it is totally ineffective if we are not aware of it, if we're not implementing it, if we're not enforcing it. And the only ways we can do all those things is if, as a community, we watch out for vulnerable and senior adults, that we report any suspicious activity that could constitute abuse, that the authorities then do what they should be doing, investigating, and then taking those investigations to your local and your state or your federal prosecutors in Nebraska, and making sure that these cases get absolutely thoroughly prosecuted where appropriate. So the biggest barrier, as I've mentioned already, is silence. And you know who's figured this out long ago? The crooks. Predators rely on silence. That's why they are able to do so many of these crimes in the open. So the time has come, as the Alberta Elder Abuse Awareness Network said it so well, time to bring this crime out into the open, into the spotlight. So the question that I want you to be thinking about with some answers today is, how do we go about breaking through this barrier of silence? Elder abuse has been called the silent epidemic of our time. And once again, we have an Attorney General agreeing that this crime is too often operating in the shadows. So for me, back in 1996, I began a very sharp learning curve, because I realized after a couple of days sitting in my office, having read the law from the 1980s, literally staring at the phone, willing that telephone to ring, looking outside of my open door and seeing uniformed police officers and detectives walk straight past my office and dumping files on the desk of my colleagues who were prosecuting domestic violence, child abuse, child abduction. But nobody was stopping at my desk and saying, "Here, Greenwood, here's your first case of elder abuse." So I started to realize that it was a crime. And the only way I started to realize this was I actually left my desk, got in my car, and started driving around our county and talked to various people. I talked to Adult Protective Services. I talked to the folks who run senior day centers. I talked to paramedics. I talked to the managers of mobile home parks. And I started to hear very similar stories, which convinced me that this was a crime that was going totally under the radar, unpunished. But I was also realizing from the stories that I was hearing that there were so many consistent characteristics that made these stories predictable. I also found that these crimes were occurring not just in the densely populated areas of the city of San Diego, but they were occurring out in the desert areas too, out near Borrego Springs, or a place called Boulevard, which is on the way to Imperial Valley and the desert. I was also realizing that we were facing a challenge here, that the folks who were advocates for child abuse prevention and domestic violence prevention were facing 30 years before me. But I also realized that this crime was only getting worse. And you know the reasons. Because of the demographics. Look at this. By the year 2030, which is only what, less than 9 years away, the number of people in this country over the age of 65 will triple to over 70 million. Do you realize too that just in one day, today, November the 5th, do you know how many people will turn 65 today in one day in America? Yes, this is the number. So the demographics point to the fact that the database that we are using to define our victims, 65 and older, is expanding so quickly, which means that more and more people of that age group will unfortunately become victims in the next few years. Well, we're all living longer too. And by the year 2030, there'll be over 130,000 people in this country who are centenarians. Now, if you don't believe me, all you got to do is turn on NBC any weekday and you will discover the secret for living longer. It's having Smuckers for breakfast. Did you not realize that? I mean, look at this wonderful lady, 106 years of age, or Bella Luna, age 104 in Colorado. But my favorite centenarian is this lady. True story, out of England. She survived to live to be 103, even though she was still smoking 7 cigarettes a day. Go figure. Now, this is also something which should be shared with all our county, state, and federal legislatures. Within the next 15 years, there'll be more adults in this country over the age of 65 than children under the age of 18. Now, just think about that for a moment, because that statistic has enormous ramifications for all of us. In Nebraska, we are seeing a real cluster of where most people in our population from under 5 to over 85, where are they currently? Well, this graph will show us. Look at the spike. You've got a lot of people in their early mid-30s, 40s, and 50s. And then you've got also a significant group from age 65 to 74 already. So with the fact that we're all living longer anyway, this number is going to increase substantially, and the percentage of over 65s in Nebraska is going to escalate over the next 15 years dramatically. And if you think about the year 2050, when all these other folks will get to that age of 65, then you can see how we are going to become a very age-centered population in Nebraska and across the country. Yet, despite the clear, obvious demographics, the blunt fact is this, as was reflected in this tweet from ACL. Now, ACL, as many of you know, is the Administration for Community Living, which is part of the Department of the Administration on Aging, the federal department in Washington, D.C. And they've been doing a phenomenal job over the last few years. But nevertheless, they tweeted this: funding for elder justice is 1% of the funding that we spend on child and family welfare. Now, I'm not advocating that we should cut anything from child or family welfare. No, not at all. But what we need to do is give parity to programs that support and enhance elder justice. So we need to really beef up the Adult Protective Services Program, the Long-Term Care Ombudsman's Program, the support agencies such as Alzheimer's Association, Meals on Wheels, Catholic Charities, and the like, who are tirelessly working with our older population in Nebraska and beyond. Because if we ignore this blunt fact, given the rise in the demographics, given the rise in the number of statistics of victims of elder abuse, we are going to get overwhelmed very quickly. Now, a measure of the inequality can be found simply in staffing issues. If you compare the number of folks who are employed right now in Nebraska in child protective services compared to the number of folks who are employed in Nebraska in adult protective services, you might be shocked at the ratio. We have got to do something about that. We have got to give adult protective services, who are on the front lines of receiving reports of allegations of some form of elder abuse, we've got to give them the funds, we've got to give them the resources that they so badly need. Now, there's been a glimmer of hope in the last year. We've actually had, because of the pandemic,
various stimulus packages, as you know, come through Washington, D.C. And as part of those stimulus packages, finally, money is being dished out to adult protective services programs all over the country. It's not enough, but it's a good starting point. But we hope and pray that governments, both county, state, and federal, will keep supporting any program that provides help for older adults in Nebraska and beyond. So this is the dynamic. The demographics is clear. The fact is we do not yet have a cure for any type of dementia, of which they tell us there are over 20 types of dementia. Obviously, Alzheimer's is the most well-known. And if you take the figure of 5 million people today in America are afflicted by Alzheimer's, then you can see the extent of the problem. Another problem is that victims are not reporting for various reasons. Another major problem is that one of the biggest, fastest growing jobs in this country that we're clamoring people to become part of the job force is home care. But with that comes risks. And what I found in the last 25 years is that there are minimal background checks, and you've got caregivers being placed into homes of older adults who own things. They have an asset, they have cash in the bank, they have investments, they have a house free and clear, they have jewelry. These are things that the caregiver could find overwhelmingly too tempting not to take. And so we're seeing that. We've got to understand, again, some of the reasons for the silence. The fact that so many older Nebraskans, like all across the country, are too afraid to report that they are victims. This leads to underreporting. The fear comes sometimes stemming from embarrassment. So many of the perpetrators of elder abuse are actual family members. So there's a lot of shame attached to being identified as a victim of some form of abuse, because nobody wants to admit, certainly publicly, in a courtroom with 12 strangers looking at them, that they have raised a son who hits his mother in the face. Nobody wants to be part of that dialogue, and I totally get that. But that adds to the silence. There's also a fear amongst a lot of older Nebraskans that by coming forward and identifying myself as a victim, that somebody in government will decide on my behalf that I need protection and will take me from my home and will place me in a secure environment called a nursing home. Now, in reality, that does not happen normally. But unfortunately, older adults throughout this country have bought into this misconception. And I know it for a fact because I have talked to so many victims during my career who did not say anything. We found out about it through other means. And when I've approached them and said, why did you keep this to yourself? The answer was typically, Mr. Greenwood, frankly, I'd rather lose $50,000 than run the risk of losing my independence and losing my home. So we have to do a better job of showing and reassuring victims of adult abuse in Nebraska that that is not a likely outcome. We're not interested in depriving the victim of their independence. I'm only interested in depriving the suspect of their independence. But when you add to this, the perpetrator will threaten the victim. And they do it in a number of ways. For example, now, wait a minute, if you pick up the phone and call 911, just imagine what's going to happen. First of all, they're going to take me away. And who's going to help you from now on? You'll be all on your own. And because you're on your own, they won't let you live here on your own. They're going to take you from your home and put you in a nursing home. Do you really want that? That's the kind of threat that so many suspects use as intimidation against the victim. So, as I started out facing this problem of silence, the increased number of victims in the database through demographics, and because of these dynamics that I was learning about, I realized, my role as a prosecutor has to change. What I mean by that is that prosecutors all over the country, all over Nebraska, are being trained in pretty much the same way. They bring us into an office, they train us on what to do, how to do it, and then they sit us down and then they bring in files. They bring in cases. Here, these are your assignments. We don't have to go looking for them. Well, this was not something that was happening to me, so I had to change my ways. I had to go from being a reactive person to being a proactive person, because typically prosecutors are reactive. We react to cases that are being brought to us, but because I was getting nothing, I had to quit that and become proactive. Now, how often have you ever heard of a prosecutor actually literally going out looking for cases to prosecute? I mean, nobody in my office, and we have 300 prosecutors, was doing that, but I had to do it. And I realized that this is the way that I needed to carry on. I believe that part of the role of prosecutors today in Nebraska and elsewhere is to be part of a networking team. And what I mean by that is being part of that community outreach. We discovered something very significant. When we use the term elder abuse, it's a very negative concept, and older adults don't like it. So one of the networking opportunities that we developed was called the Elder Protection Council. And this became a great success, partly because of the word protection. There's no mention of abuse. And we wanted to encourage people to meet together once every 2 months or so. And there were 3 prongs to the purpose for the meeting: to raise awareness of the crime, to enhance prevention, and to improve protection. And this has proved to be a successful model for us. I'm a great believer in starting local. So wherever you are on this webinar, I would urge you to start thinking county-wide. What can I do within my community in this county to help raise awareness, to enhance protection, etc. But yet, to keep in mind the big picture as to what's going on elsewhere. I like words that begin with the same letter. It's just a technique I've used in court a lot of times. I talk about the 3 C's in building what I call a multidisciplinary team approach to tackling the rising tide of elder abuse cases in Nebraska and beyond. The 3 C's are very simple: collaboration, cooperation, and communication. And once we applied these 3 C's, we saw a significant dent into the barrier of silence. I began with this key triangle concept. And I decided early on that really we needed to focus our attention on the 3 prongs of a triangle. The prosecutor angle obviously was the one I was in, but I wanted to reach out to law enforcement and to the umbrella of social services, including adult protective services, the long-term care ombudsman, and the public guardian's office. And you have all 3 of those in your state of Nebraska. Dealing with social services, I realized that we needed to do a far better job of promoting the whole idea of who adult protective services are and who the long-term care ombudsman are. Because as you heard me say at the beginning, when my boss called me in and said he's had an upsetting call from adult protective services, my first question was, who are they? I'd never heard of them. Of course, I'd heard of child protective services. And so it made me realize, we've got to do a far better job at letting the public know what these agencies do. And so we developed a campaign. I was able to secure the help of an advertising agency free of charge. They did this pro bono. They came up with this slogan called "Silence Isn't Golden." And they sat me down, and this was just a few months into my start of my time in this assignment. And they said, well, what are the main problems? I said, well, silence is a problem. And they said, well, what are the types of crimes that are out there? I said, well, I think, and I said, there's physical abuse. And they said, okay, we'll make that the red poster. I said, there's financial abuse. They said, okay, we'll make that the green poster. And then there's neglect. And they said, okay, we'll make that the blue poster. And so within a year, suddenly all these posters were produced, and we found them on public buildings, on bus shelters, libraries, police stations, hospitals, dental offices. Wherever people went, they saw these posters. And you know what happened? Suddenly people became more familiar. If there's one thing we need to do in Nebraska to put the spotlight firmly on this crime, is to make sure that every Nebraskan knows how to report it if they see it or hear it. Now, one thing that has been really exciting in the last month is 2 years ago, I was speaking, before the pandemic, I was speaking in Southwest Virginia. I showed them this model advertising campaign that we developed. After the conference, they contacted me. I heard nothing more for a long time, but then suddenly, a month ago, this is what came through my email. They have adopted the same campaign. They used the template that we had, and now this is there in Southwest Virginia for every motorist along a freeway to see. Silence isn't golden. They are adopting the red poster for physical abuse, the green one for financial, and the blue one for neglect. It's really exciting. Now, how about a similar campaign in Nebraska? Wouldn't that be something to give the public something to remember, a phone number to call? So what is the phone number for calling the hotline, the reporting line? Do we know it? And do the mandated reporters know it? And in fact, who are the mandated reporters of suspected vulnerable and elder adult abuse in Nebraska? Well, here they are. It's a bit of a list, but maybe you're on this list. And so there's certain people on this list that you think automatically should be there, which is good. But I'm looking down and I see one very important section that is not included, and I'm just going to throw it out there. Several years ago, we pushed for every single bank teller and credit union teller in California to become a mandated reporter of suspected elder financial exploitation. And that has become very effective. I would urge you to consider having every single financial institution employee to become a mandated reporter. But if you're a mandated reporter, and even if you're not, it says any other person may report abuse. Well, if you don't know the phone number, then it's going to be a struggle. So what is the phone number? Well, thankfully, you got this number, 800-652-1999. So that's a pretty easy number to remember, 652-1999. And it is a 24-hour hotline, which I'm pleased to see. So hopefully every police officer in Nebraska has this phone number in their pocket. Every mandated reporter has this phone number in their pocket. And hopefully a lot of non-mandated reporters in Nebraska will write this number down and keep it. Hopefully we can have this number on public television from time to time. Maybe we can mount a campaign of Silence Isn't Golden and have this number on the screen or on the radio. And thankfully, on your Adult Protective Services website, you've got the same number, 800-652-1999. So this is excellent. It's a start. It's good, but we need to do more to get this number out there to the general public so they know who to call. Now, dealing with local law enforcement, again, because they weren't handing me any cases, I went around our county talking with every single law enforcement agency who would be willing to hear me. And boy, as I did that, and as I also went to other places in the county, I learned a lot. Unfortunately, what I learned was this: through no fault of anybody, but basically because of lack of training and awareness, we were overlooking several victims. Worse, we were ignoring them. Even worse, we were disbelieving them. And even the worst of all, we were abandoning them. And when I say abandon, I mean that we were not taking reports, we were closing down investigations through misunderstandings, through misconceptions. And as a result, no cases were ever being forwarded to me. This was the reality. And I believe that it's still happening in every corner of this country. Some of this is going on. We are just not reaching as many victims as we should. So again, this is why today is so important. The major reason why law enforcement was either ignoring, abandoning, or just failing to recognize was because they were falling into common misconceptions. And what I want to do before we take our first break at 1:15 is really drill down with some of these misconceptions. We need to understand what is standing in our way. And these misconceptions or myths are real. And I believe that it's happening in law enforcement circles in Nebraska, as it did and is happening in California. The most popular misconception that I heard, and I still hear, is that a lot of law enforcement wrongly think that elderly people will make ineffective witnesses in the courtroom. And I was very curious about this, and so I explored why do you say that? And the most common response that I got was, well, forgetfulness. Well, having had the privilege of presenting in court, gosh, well over 750 felony cases, and having been involved in over several thousand cases with some of my colleagues, this is wrong. I think this is far more accurate. Age doesn't make us forgetful. It's having a multitasking, overwhelming conflict going on in our minds that makes us forgetful. And many of us today, right now, we have so many things spinning through our heads. And as a result, things don't get done. We overlook them, we forget them. In fact, we all rely on stickies, do we not? On your desk, I'm sure you've got some reminder somewhere about something you have to do later today, tonight, over the weekend. Maybe it's your turn to buy refreshments for the kids' soccer team. You know, you've got to go get those oranges from your supermarket or whatever. But we rely on that. When you go to Costco, don't you take your list with you? Because if you don't and you come out and you go home, you go, oh man, I forgot that. We're all subject to forgetfulness. So don't let anybody convince you that if you become 85, if you're 85, therefore you are going to be an unreliable witness in the courtroom. So unfortunately, we would throw out these stereotypes about the ineffective nature of witnesses of a certain age group. And the only one which is slightly true is number 3. Yeah, they can be, some of my victims could have the tendency to become long-winded. You know, the favorite phrase was, Mr. Greenwood, let me tell you my story. No, you're not. So what I had to do was develop a style that was not offensive, hopefully, but was firm. Okay, I'm not going to let you tell me your story, but this is what we're going to do. I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes asking you several questions, and you must keep your answers brief. And if you don't, then I'm going to cut you off and keep you grounded. Why did I have to adopt that? It's because law enforcement and prosecutors are element driven. Now, what I mean by that is that my job in the courtroom is to prove to a group of strangers, 12 people, that certain elements of a crime have been established beyond a reasonable doubt. And typically in any crime statute, there's at least 4, 5, or 6 elements that I have to prove to the jury. Now, no matter how brilliant my evidence is on 3 of the elements, if the 4th element is missing, then no matter how good the other 3 element evidence is, doesn't matter. It's a not guilty straight across the board. And so I have to ensure early on in my conversations that those elements are present during this talk with the victim. And the only way I can get to those elements is by taking control of the conversation. So that's what I encourage people to do, particularly in law enforcement, is become focused on the elements that are required to establish the crime that you're hearing about from the victim. Now, just as an example, look at these 7 ladies. Wouldn't any prosecutor love to have these 7 ladies sitting on a bench outside a courtroom, ready to be brought in one after the other to testify against the defendant? And that's the kind of luxury that I had. This case involved 13 elderly female residents of an assisted living facility, all of whom had become victims of the same defendant. He was the janitor in the assisted living facility. He was the fixer. He fixed the things that were going wrong in their individual rooms. So an electric socket that wasn't working, the light fixture that needed, the bulb needed replacing, the television that didn't work properly. They would call downstairs and he would respond, and then he would say to each of them, hey, it's going to be a bit noisy, maybe a little dusty in here for a little bit because I'm going to use my drill. Why don't you go and have a cup of coffee? So he would be left alone in the apartment. What would he do? Apart from repairing the work, he would steal their jewelry. So ultimately, these 7 ladies showed up for court. I had 13 victims, but out of the other missing 6, 3 had medical issues, and the other 3, I think at the time, were on cruises, because that's what used to happen in San Diego. A lot of my elderly victims disappeared on cruises for a while. Anyway, these 7 ladies were there. They were ready to testify, and they were a formidable force against the defendant. Now, just to prove this to you, I had offered to the defendant, with no prior convictions, a stipulated 10-year prison term for what he had done to 13 victims. That offer had been totally rejected by the defense attorney, and even the judge in chambers had described it as being a very tough offer. And so I said, fine, let's put it on. Well, the day of this hearing, I invited the defense attorney to come out and meet all these victims. I could tell he was shocked. After talking to each of them, he went back into the courtroom and 15 minutes later came out with a signed change of plea form. His client did not want to face the wrath of these ladies. So there is power and ability to really affect the outcome of a case because of these older victims. Take this lady here, bless her heart, early stages of dementia, a victim in an assisted living facility as well. She'd had her accounts forged, checks being forged by a caregiver who worked in the facility. Yeah, she had some memory issues, but overall, she was an incredible witness, and the defendant ultimately pled guilty. So that's what I wanted to get across. Number 2 on my list, if the elderly victim refuses to provide information, I was being told, that's it, Greenwood, nothing more can be done. For example, you take this kind of case and this kind of case. These are both victims of physical abuse by their sons. But we've learned from prior cases of domestic violence, this fact, we can still build a case by talking to other key witnesses, neighbors, other family members, hospital staff, paramedics. We can build this case and then allow the DA, the prosecutor, to figure out a way to break through the victim's embarrassment, the wall of silence. Now, not in every case will be successful, but you have to confront it and try it. Because the bottom line is this, for law enforcement and for prosecutors, if we are going to put a firm dent into this rising crime of elder abuse, we cannot allow victims to dictate which cases get prosecuted. Self-determination isn't the solution for us. Now, I know I'm treading on very difficult ground here when it comes to adult protective services, because self-determination for the adult is a revered principle, and I totally accept that. But in law enforcement and prosecutorial circles, it should not be the prevailing factor. But unfortunately, it can be the prevailing factor in some law enforcement. These three words are words that I dreaded. There are times when a case is referred to law enforcement. Law enforcement will go out and talk to the victim. The victim will say, yeah, but you know what? I don't want anything to happen to my son. I don't want him to be arrested. Yeah, he hit me, but you know what? We can deal with it. Or he stole from me, but that's okay. You know, I can get by. And so the police officer hears that and writes in his or her report, victim declines prosecution. That is wrong. Take this, for example. So I was reviewing a case and I realized there had been a prior incident in 2008. I wanted to find out what happened to that case. So I sent my victim advocate down to the police station. She found the report and look at what it says at the very bottom. This case non-prosecutable and will be cancelled as exceptional. Victim declined to prosecute. This is wrong. So we've got to encourage law enforcement not to write this, not to practice this. Even in cases that were brought to me. Look at this. I asked, this is the detective speaking, I asked McLean if he wants to press charges. And he said yes. So the case came to me. But when I issued it, I talked to the detective, I thanked him for his work, and I said, please do me a favor. Please don't ever ask victims that question again, because it's not appropriate, it's not relevant. So hopefully we can convince law enforcement in Nebraska not to simply close a case when a victim asks them to do it. But it does happen. This is a police chief in another state. Look at a quote in a newspaper. He says, my officers always respond to calls, treating potential victims with compassion and dignity. And then he said, we charge when the charges are there to be made and if we have a willing victim. No, I think that's inappropriate. Many cases, especially in domestic violence in Nebraska, the victim is not willing to cooperate, not willing to participate. Do we just walk away? Because if we walk away from those elder abuse and domestic violence cases, one thing I think could well happen. In 6 months' time, that same victim is no longer with us because they've been murdered by their predator. But again, this is another proof. Here in another state, they talked about suspects were arrested in 12 cases. In 3 cases, the victim did not press charges. Wrong. Look at what a Rhode Island newspaper said. Elder abuse victims reluctant to press charges. We're giving the wrong signal to the public. So just to reiterate, why am I calling this a problem? Because if we do not intervene, the perpetrator will abuse again. Now, why am I so definite about that? I rely on human nature to tell me that it will happen again. How do I know that? Well, unfortunately, I've seen it in the cases that repeat offenders, but I've also known as a kid, as a child, if I got away with something, did I do it again? Yep, I did. Until I got caught and I got punished for it. Then it stopped. So I think it's the same with adults. You know, adult perpetrators, if they think they've got a free rein here, they will do it again. But next time they'll do it worse. Next time they'll steal more money. Next time they'll move on to another innocent victim and do it against them too, because they have this emboldened view that I can get away with it. And what have we learned from domestic violence in the last 40 years? We've learned that we can convict even when the victim is uncooperative or is even hostile. Because the bottom line is this: the abuse is not just against the victim, the abuse is against the whole of the Nebraska community. So when an older adult in Nebraska today is being targeted and is being victimized, is being physically injured or being financially exploited, it hurts all of us, not just that one person. Now, who in Nebraska is doing most of the physical abuse of an older adult? It's this guy. How do I know it's happening in Nebraska? Because human nature is the same in Nebraska as it is in San Diego. And this is the #1 defendant that I prosecuted in the 22 years in San Diego. He lives in your neighborhood. He may live in your street. In fact, he may live next door to you. And this is who he is. This is his age range. He lives at home, typically with his widowed mother. And he's either one of 3 types of sons. He's either divorced and come back to live, or he's single and he's never left home, or he's totally unmotivated to leave home, or he's just got released last night from jail, and the only place he can come home to is his mother's. In the majority of these cases, the son is lazy. He's unemployed. And he also has an addiction. It's typically drugs, methamphetamine, alcohol. It's vodka and or beer are the likely choices. Or thirdly, he's a gambling addict. And because he's unemployed and these addictions cost money, what does he do? He steals from his mother. What does he steal? He steals jewelry. He pawns it at the pawn shop in Lincoln or Omaha or elsewhere. And sometimes these sons actually have a history of undiagnosed, untreated mental illness. Now, do you recognize this? Because he's living there in your community. And right now he may be committing acts of violence or acts of financial exploitation against his own mother, who, for whatever reason, some of them I've shared already, is not going to report it to Adult Protective Services or law enforcement. So it's going to require somebody else to come forward. It might be another family member. It might be the next door neighbor who hears the screams and the yelling and the shouts. It might be the postal carrier who comes and talks to mum. It might be the Meals on Wheels delivery person who sees the bruises. Or it might be the hairdresser who is concerned about the number of marks on the mother's arms or on her neck. Whoever it is, I hope that they will make that call to Adult Protective Services and or law enforcement, because if we fail to do that, bad things happen. You know, Tennessee said it correctly. They said, what do you call someone who abuses an 80-year-old woman? You call him son. And here's a father, it's not just mothers, but a father who was attacked by his own son with the rim of a glass of beer. This mother was attacked by her own son. The police did a fantastic job. The swelling gets worse. So here it is. And 3 days later, you go back and get the photo you need for the prosecutor. And here's the son that I have profiled and who I've described, I think, fairly accurately. And he lives, not this particular guy, but the profile of that son lives in your neighborhood. This mother who was a victim at the hands of her son, our statute allows me to prosecute as a felony, even though the injury is slight, because the language of our statute says under circumstances likely to cause great bodily injury. And I like that, because as we all know, if you push an elderly person, and even if they thankfully don't get a serious injury from it, the potential for serious injury is enormous, because if you cause somebody to lose their balance, in their 70s or 80s, the risk of them falling and breaking a hip is substantial. And if you've ever met an older Nebraskan who's broken their hip, age 75, 80, 85, it can totally transform and cause a deterioration in their whole outlook on life and their lifestyle. And then people with blood thinners who are grabbed, it can be bad. Photos of victims before and after are very effective. And you just saw glimpses of some of the ugly cases involving mothers who've been attacked by their sons. Now, you may feel I'm coming over a little too aggressive, a little too dogmatic about this, but it's because of what I've seen. It's because of what I've prosecuted, and it's because of a fear that I have that if we do not adopt this approach, then there will be more victims who will suffer cruel and terrible punishment. Why am I so determined? It's because of cases like this. This victim who lived in her own home in Carlsbad and who lived and took in her son that fit the profile that I've described for you. She lived in a townhouse, very nice townhouse. Either side of the house, the neighbors could hear almost every single evening this son shouting horrible words towards his mother. I mean, really distressing conversations that the neighbors got very concerned about, to the point where they called Adult Protective Services. APS knocked on her door. She opens it somewhat. They identify themselves. They ask if they can come in, and she refuses politely and says, "Thank you, but I don't need your help." Why did she do that? She's embarrassed. She's also afraid her son was probably listening from behind the door. Now, Adult Protective Services in Nebraska, just like in California, don't have any power to push past her and come in. If the person, like this lady, said no thank you, they have to walk away. And it's a very difficult situation to find yourself in as an APS caseworker. Well, what happened? Things got worse. The son left notes like this all around the house, to the point where the mother became so afraid. Do you think she called Adult Protective Services or the police? No. You know what she did? She went to her local library and borrowed a law book on how to evict somebody. How do we know that? Because we found this letter in the bedroom of her son. 7 days after she wrote this letter of eviction, the son murdered his mother, picked up a valuable statue, a large oak statue, and smashed it over his mother's head, bludgeoned her to death. That's what I feel. If we do nothing, that is a potential consequence. And I've learned, unfortunately, through having conducted over 10 homicide trials and having dealt with other homicide cases that ended up as a guilty negotiated plea, that if we fail to intervene at an earlier stage, worse things happen. And in most of those cases of homicides, the defendant was a family member. And in those cases, there were often unreported history of crimes being committed against the victim. How would we discover them? Because after the homicide occurred, the family would be in grief. We would be talking to them, and as they started unloading, they would tell us, "Yep, it's been going on." But the mother was insistent. She said she could deal with the problem. She wanted to help her son or her daughter. She didn't want us to get involved. She didn't want the dirty laundry to be aired in public. You've heard the same stories. My last homicide case involved this mother. She had been an Afghan refugee during the Russian invasion in the 1970s. And she fled first to the UK and then with her husband to San Diego. And they had adopted at an early age a daughter from Turkey, I believe. And so they all came as a family. One day, this mother went missing inexplicably. And the family was so upset and couldn't understand. And they were all looking for mother, except one person, the daughter. The daughter who was spending her time at the house. She lived there. She was a meth addict. The house became a tip. This is the defendant daughter. A very minor criminal record, but there were unreported instances of 3 years earlier where she'd been stealing jewelry from her mother to support her meth addiction. This case turned from a missing persons report into a homicide thanks to a very alert police officer who, when he was walking around the house looking for any indications of where this missing victim might be, saw this notepad and saw at the top the words coping skills / tips on dealing with the bitch. He also saw this note: going stir crazy, being cooped up here with the bitch, bugging me every 4.5 minutes. And he said, who wrote these notes? And the family said, daughter. As soon as he saw that, he called in the homicide unit. They secured the house as a crime scene because they believed that the mother was not missing, that she was murdered. One of the indicators was that in the guest bath, there was a tub and there was a bleach container, and there was an overwhelming smell of bleach. It was apparent that there had been a catastrophic event in that bathroom where somebody had tried to get rid of the evidence. In the garage was evidence of a meth addict's home. This is what meth addicts do. They accumulate property from the streets and bring it back. The homicide team seized the car, which had been jointly used by defendant daughter and mother. They stripped it. They did luminol testing. If you've ever watched CSI, you may have heard of the word luminol. Luminol is a chemical that reacts with blue light whenever there's blood present. And what you're looking there is the presence of blood throughout the trunk of the car. So we knew that the mother had tragically been murdered in her own house, and the body had been transported in the car somewhere and put in the trunk. The police swabbed the blood. They took the electric toothbrush from the bathroom of the victim. They extracted DNA from the toothbrush. They matched it to the DNA from the blood sample, and it was a direct match. So we knew that this was the victim's blood. Inside the car was a receipt from Walmart. Look at what was purchased the night when the mother went missing: bleach and trash bags. Also in the car was a gambling card. The daughter not only was a drug addict, she had a gambling addiction. So we looked up at the casino. We found that through video evidence and through other things, the daughter had been at the casino at 4:45 the following morning after mother went missing. Where is the casino? In a very remote part of San Diego. We seized the computer and we did search warrants on that. And the police did a fantastic job on forensically looking through the Google searches. And look what somebody was Googling the night when victim went missing. They were looking for information about bloodstains, about homicide investigations, about bloodstain pattern. Who was doing this? Well, thankfully, whoever was doing it was using a public Wi-Fi connection at McDonald's. So we went to McDonald's, and in the middle, very right, you can see an outline of our defendant daughter with her laptop Googling at the time when these searches were being done. So I could prove to a jury that this was the defendant who was doing the searches. And it ended up in a trial, and the mother gained some justice for herself, even though she was passed away, and for the family, it was a closure for them. The defendant was convicted of first-degree murder. But this case could possibly have been avoided had the prior thefts been reported to law enforcement. Myth number 3, if my victim gives the money voluntarily, I was being told it's not a crime. How many times do law enforcement tell family members or even adult protective services in Nebraska, it's just a civil matter? It happens everywhere. It's pervasive. But I've learned over time that things are not always how they first appear. Take this picture, for example. Now, take a look at this. Immediately you think, well, what kind of bird is it? But take a closer look at it. It's not a bird. It's a person sitting on a tree stump with their hand over their head. Do you see that? Do you see the elbow? Do you see the hand? Do you see the shoulder blade? Do you see the knee? Do you see the left toe? And that is a learning tool, because what appears on the surface to be a, quote, a civil matter, because it's consensual, is not. Because what the apparent consensual nature has been evaporated by what I call fraud, deception, lies, misrepresentation, by undue influence, and we'll talk about that in more detail in the second session, or by exploiting the mental limitations of the victim. Any of those situations negate the defense of consent. Take this, for example. On the left is my victim with Parkinson's. On the very right is her late husband who dies. In the middle is the crook. He works at the facility where victim ended up after she sold the house and moved into the assisted living facility with money left over from the sale of the house. And at that moment, this crook who works there decides, I want to steal that money. So what does he do? One night while she's at dinner, he walks into her room. He has the key to every room, right? He removes photograph of husband and wife from the mantelpiece. He then Adobe Photoshops his image and creates this bogus photo that you're now looking at. He waits until the victim's Parkinson is really taking effect, and he sits down with her and convinces her that this photo is proof that he is in fact her long lost nephew. And as a result, convinces her to move out, to purchase a property using her money and putting it into joint names with him so that he can, quote, take care of her for the rest of her life. The significance to the suspect is that when she dies, he will inherit because he is a joint tenant on the property with her, and the joint tenancy overrides anything she has in her will. So when the family found out about this new living arrangement, they became suspicious and they called the police, but the police turned around and said it's just a civil matter. Thankfully, this case ended up at our office, and an investigator took this case, dug deep, and found this smoking gun of this photo. And as a result, we were able to prosecute the suspect for theft, and he ended up in prison. Take this case of theft of baby grand pianos. We ended up with a case of 19 elderly victims in San Diego, all of whom had downsized, and all of whom, to downsize, had consigned their pianos to a piano store, a business. But over a period of 5 years, not one of these victims ever received back their piano or ever received anything from the dealer for a sale of the piano. All he would do was give them excuse after excuse. So finally, one of the victims decided, this guy has stolen from me. That was a fair assumption. He called the police. What did the police tell him? This is all a civil issue, and the police department would not be able to assist. This was a business transaction. Now, this kind of response is being repeated all over the country today by police officers, well-meaning as they are, but it's wrong. Police officers should never be determining whether a matter is civil or criminal. Now, you may find that strange to come from me, but it's true. For anyone to determine whether a matter is civil or criminal requires a significant amount of legal qualification to make that determination. The only person who should be doing that is the prosecutor in your county, or the Attorney General's office, or the US Attorney's office in Nebraska, not a police officer. So how on earth did I hear about this case? I heard about it because the victim who got this email was unhappy and went to the media, told his story to a TV station. TV station aired that story. As a result, I saw that story. I contacted the TV station. They gave me the names of 19 victims. And what you're seeing on the screen here is a copy of the complaint that I filed, filing 38 felony counts against the defendant shop owner. Ultimately, he pled guilty to 4 felonies and agreed restitution of $144,000. In the last few minutes before we take a break, and before then I come back later on this morning with part 2. Myth number 4, a power of attorney does not provide a license to steal and plunder. This is a huge misconception that so often police officers, again, through no fault of their own, it's just a lack of training, fall into. Now, any state has powers of attorney. They're complex. These are difficult documents to understand for anybody, let alone a 78-year-old victim, maybe with some form of cognitive limitations. So don't just say because the defendant, the suspect has power of attorney, therefore there's nothing we can do. No, we need to look at the circumstances surrounding the creation and execution of the power of attorney. We need to ask this question: did the victim have the ability to understand the need for this document? We need to ask this question: whose idea was it for the power of attorney? Was it the victim's idea, or was it the suspect's idea? For whom was this document drawn up to benefit? Is it going to benefit the victim or the suspect? You look at whether or not the power of attorney has been notarized or witnessed under the terms of your state regulations. Maybe you should be interviewing the witnesses. And just because the holder of the power of attorney is a family member who may be the only living relative and who is going to say to you, well, what's the big deal? I'm going to inherit anyway when she dies. No. What we say, accelerated inheritance, is not a good defense. And then one more misconception before I say a few closing comments for this first part. If we only discover the theft of the crime of exploitation after the older adult or the incapacitated adult is deceased, a lot of police will tell you there's nothing we can do. Now, that is not correct. Theft, exploitation, even when the victim is no longer with us. For example, if the suspect has forged the documents that then transfers the asset to the suspect, we do not need the victim alive to prove forgery. And I always tell people, we do not need the victim alive to prove homicide, right? Every day in America, there are juries who are convicting defendants of murder where they have never heard from the victim. So I always tell people, well, treat it as if it's a homicide, because there are some situations in which we do not need the victim in order to prosecute the case. So we need to keep that in mind. Now, what I'd like you to be doing over this next hour or so, I believe we have a chat box for those of you on the webinar, or for those of you who are literally in the classroom. I would like you to be asking some questions, and I will give us time at the end to actually have questions asked of me. And I would welcome that, because I really hope that there are things on here that you want to challenge me on or get me to clarify. And I know I've covered quite a bit of material, and I'm going to do so in the second session. So please bear that in mind. And before I leave this topic, after discussing these misconceptions with law enforcement, the next step is to persuade them to designate a go-to person within the agency. I think it is absolutely important, particularly for the morale of adult protective services, that there is always a go-to person within every law enforcement agency in Nebraska, that they can pick up the phone or send an email or a text and say, hey, I'm working this case with a client. I believe I need your support, your help. Is there any chance you can work this with me? Everybody needs that go-to person. So we were able to convince most police chiefs and most appointed sheriffs in our jurisdiction, of which there are, gosh, almost 19 different law enforcement agencies, to have that assignment given. And I would urge you, if you don't have a go-to person in your community, talk to your police chief, talk to your sheriff, and please ask them to make that happen so you have that ability to go to that person. After the break, and after I come back, I'm going to talk about how we can get the buy-in of various prosecutors. So at this moment, I'm just going to check to see if we have any body in the chat. Well, I guess I don't have a chat room here. So, okay. Anyway, I'm going to hand back to Morgan or to whoever and conduct the next part of the program. Thank you so very much.
All right, thank you, Paul, for that presentation. I've just minimized our Zoom chat here. We'll leave the screen up for the break, so if people have questions.
Very good. And Morgan, thank you so much. And Mr. Greenwood, this has just been an outstanding presentation. We look forward to having you joining us after we have our next session after the break, including a legislative update from Kelly Lammers and Claire McHenry with the Nebraska Department of Banking and Finance. And again, then we will have Mr. Greenwood rejoin us at 11 o'clock. So again, we are taking a break and we will come back together at 10:30 Central Time. Thank you.